He was making $14 an hour, his hands smelling of stale coffee and exhaust. She was worth $4 billion, suffocating inside a custom silk suit. He pointed at her $500,000 Ferrari and made a deadpan joke about it being his. She didn't laugh. She just tossed him the keys. The asphalt outside the towering glass entrance of the Vanguard building always smelled like ozone and hot rubber, even in late October, when the wind coming off the river carried a wet, freezing bite. Kevin stood at the valet podium, shifting his weight from his left foot to his right. The arch of his left foot had collapsed 3 years ago, a dull, throbbing reminder of 12-hour shifts spent standing on concrete. He rubbed a thumb against his index finger. There was a permanent crust of motor oil and cheap hand soap embedded in the cuticles, a texture like fine grit sandpaper. He checked his phone. Screen cracked diagonally across the center. 10:42 p.m. If he didn't clock out by 11, he'd miss the last express bus, which meant he'd be 30 minutes late relieving Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who watched his 6-year-old son, Leo. She was cheap, but she was strict, and late meant a $10 penalty. Kevin didn't have $10 to bleed. "Look at this obnoxious thing," Greg muttered, leaning against the podium. Greg was 22, still possessing the unearned optimism of someone who hadn't yet realized this job was a trap, not a stepping stone. Kevin followed Greg's gaze. Idling in the VIP lane was a Ferrari 812 Superfast. It was painted a shade of red that felt violently loud, like an open wound against the grey, damp backdrop of the city. The engine didn't hum. It rattled the pavement. It sounded impatient, aggressive, spitting a low, guttural idle that vibrated up through the soles of Kevin's worn-out orthopedic shoes. $500,000, Greg whistled, crossing his arms. Imagine having the kind of money where you can just leave that sitting on the street while you eat a $1,000 steak upstairs. Kevin stared at the car. The sheer, stupid excess of it made his jaw clench. He thought about the electric bill folded in his back pocket, printed on cheap, rough paper. He thought about the expiration date on the milk in his fridge. "Yeah," Kevin said, his voice flat, dry as dust. "It's a hassle, honestly. I usually just let her keep it parked here on weekends, so I don't have to deal with the insurance." Greg snorted. "No, really," Kevin continued, deadpan, leaning his elbows on the cold steel of the podium. "The gas mileage is terrible, and there's no room for the kid's booster seat in the back. A complete impulse buy on my part. Is that right?" The voice came from behind them. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the low roar of the city traffic like a surgical scalpel. Kevin turned. Emma stood there. She didn't look like a billionaire, at least not the kind you saw on television. There was no heavy jewelry, no flashy logos. She wore a charcoal wool coat tailored so precisely it looked like architecture rather than clothing. But it was her face that made Kevin freeze. She looked entirely hollowed out. Her skin was pale, illuminated by the harsh, flickering fluorescence of the hotel marquee. There were bruised, purple shadows under her eyes, and her posture was rigid, as if her spine were made of glass, and she was terrified of shattering. She smelled like something incredibly expensive, a sharp scent of bergamot and cold leather, but beneath it there was the faint, sour tang of adrenaline and exhaustion. Kevin dropped his hands to his sides, the heat rushing up his neck. "Ma'am, apologies. Just killing time on the shift. Your keys are right here." He reached into the wooden lockbox, his fingers brushing the heavy carbon fiber key fob. It felt dense, substantial. He held it out toward her. Emma looked at the key. She didn't raise her hand to take it. She looked past Kevin, staring at the red machine idling in the drive. To everyone else, it was a masterpiece of Italian engineering. To her, it was a tomb. She had bought it 3 months ago on the advice of her wealth manager, a pathetic attempt to feel a rush of dopamine after finalizing a merger that resulted in 2,000 people losing their jobs. She had driven it off the lot, felt the raw, terrifying power of the engine, and felt absolutely nothing. Nothing but the crushing weight of her own isolation. She looked back at Kevin. She noted the frayed edge of his collar, the cheap synthetic material of his uniform jacket, the exhausted slump of his shoulders. She saw a man surviving, grinding his teeth down to the root just to get to tomorrow. "You think it's yours?" she asked. Her voice was entirely devoid of sarcasm. It was a genuine question, heavy and bizarre. "Just a bad joke, Mom," Kevin said, his chest tightening. "Don't get fired," he thought. "Just keep your head down and hand over the key. Don't lose this job over a stupid comment." "Do you know what it feels like to drive it?" Emma asked, taking a half-step closer. The cold wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, but she didn't bother brushing it away. Kevin hesitated. "I just park them, Mom. 10 miles an hour max." Emma stared at him. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Greg had backed away, sensing the sudden, strange volatility in the air. Inside Emma's chest, a knot that had been tight for a decade suddenly snapped. It wasn't a calculated corporate maneuver. It wasn't a charity write-off. It was a sudden, violent rejection of the cage she had built for herself. The car was an anchor. Everything she owned was an anchor. She finally raised her hand, but not to take the key from Kevin's palm. She pushed his hand back toward his own chest. "Then keep it," Emma said. Kevin blinked. He didn't process the words. "Mom, you said it was yours. Take it. The title is in the glove box. I already signed the transfer slip yesterday because I was going to give it to a broker." She let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a dry sob. "I can't look at it anymore." Kevin stared at her, his brain misfiring. I can't. That's a $500,000 car." "It's metal and rubber," Emma said, her voice flattening out, the momentary emotion locked away again. "And it's yours." Before Kevin could speak, Emma turned on the heel of her boot. The sharp clack echoed on the concrete. She walked to the curb, opened the back door of a bruised, dented yellow taxi that had just dropped off a hotel guest, and slid inside. The door slammed shut. The taxi merged into traffic, its red taillights bleeding into the wet reflections on the road, leaving Kevin standing on the curb, his fingers wrapped tight around the carbon fiber key. The Vanguard's underground locker room smelled of mildew and stale deodorant. Kevin sat on the wooden bench, his uniform jacket folded neatly in his locker. He was wearing his street clothes, a faded grey hoodie and a pair of jeans that were wearing thin at the knees. In his right hand, he held the key fob. It had been an hour. His shift was over. Greg had told him to call the cops. The shift manager had told him to leave the car in the VIP lot and let the hotel lawyers handle it in the morning. But Kevin hadn't done either. He had walked out to the red monstrosity, slid into the driver's seat, and moved it to the employee garage. Now, he had to go home, and his 2004 Honda Civic wouldn't start. The alternator had finally died an hour before his shift ended, a fact he had been desperately trying to ignore. Kevin swallowed hard, his throat dry. He stood up, grabbed his duffel bag, and walked out into the cavernous concrete structure of the garage. The Ferrari was parked in the far corner, looking absurdly out of place next to the rusted-out sedans and battered pickup trucks of the hotel staff. He approached it slowly, like it was a sleeping predator. He unlocked it. The car chirped, a sharp, aggressive sound, and the door handles extended outward. Kevin pulled the door open. The smell hit him instantly. Rich, unadulterated leather, Alcantara suede, and the faint chemical scent of high-end conditioning fluid. It didn't smell like a car. It smelled like a private jet. He slid into the driver's seat. It sat impossibly low to the ground. The bucket seat gripped his ribs tightly, unforgiving and rigid. He placed his calloused hands on the steering wheel. It was contoured, half leather, half carbon fiber. He pressed the bright red engine start button on the steering wheel. Behind him, a 6.5-liter V12 engine detonated into life. Kevin jumped in his seat. The sound was a physical force. It bounced off the concrete walls of the parking garage, a mechanical scream that settled into a vibrating, bass-heavy rumble. His hands were shaking. This wasn't a gift. This was a liability. This was a bomb waiting to go off in his life. He put it in gear, his foot feathering the accelerator. The car lurched forward, violent and eager. It took him 10 minutes just to navigate out of the garage, terrified of scraping the front splitter on the steep concrete ramps. When he finally pulled out onto the city streets, the rain had started again, smearing the streetlights into long, bleeding streaks of yellow and red across the windshield. The wipers moved silently, efficiently. Kevin drove 20 miles under the speed limit. Every pothole sent a shockwave up his spine. The suspension was meant for a racetrack, not the cratered infrastructure of the city's industrial district. Other drivers stared. A guy in a modified Subaru pulled up next to him at a red light, revving his engine, trying to bait Kevin into a race. Kevin just stared straight ahead, gripping the wheels so hard his knuckles were entirely white, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He crossed the bridge, leaving the gleaming high-rises behind. The landscape shifted to pawn shops, boarded-up storefronts, and sprawling, low-income apartment complexes. He pulled into the parking lot of his building. The chain-link fence was peeled back where someone had backed a moving truck into it 3 years ago. The single overhead sodium light flickered, casting a sickly, orange glow over the cracked asphalt. Kevin parked the Ferrari between a rusted minivan and a dumpster. The contrast was so stark it made him nauseous. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was ringing in his ears. He sat there for a long time, listening to the hot metal of the exhaust ticking as it began to cool in the damp night air. He reached into the glove box. His fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound manual. Beneath it was a manila envelope. He pulled it out. Inside was the title, signed, blank on the buyer's line. She wasn't crazy, Kevin thought, tracing his thumb over the ink of her signature. She knew exactly what she was doing. He got out, locked the car, and sprinted up 3 flights of concrete stairs to his apartment. Mrs. Gable was asleep on the ratty floral sofa, the television glowing silently with a late-night infomercial. Kevin gently tapped her shoulder, pressed $30 into her wrinkled hand, including the late fee, and walked her to the door. He went into the small bedroom. Leo was asleep, a tangle of limbs beneath a faded Spider-Man blanket. The room smelled like cheap laundry detergent and the distinct, warm scent of a sleeping child. Kevin sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned quietly. He buried his face in his hands, feeling the rough grit on his skin, inhaling the smell of his own exhausted sweat. Down in the parking lot, surrounded by broken glass and garbage, sat a car worth more than Kevin would make in 10 lifetimes. It was uninsured. It was untaxed. It took premium fuel he couldn't afford. Across the city, Emma sat in the back of the yellow taxi. The vinyl seat was sticky, and the cab smelled like stale cigarette smoke covered up by an aggressive pine air freshener. The shocks were shot, and every bump jolted her spine. She stared out the window at the passing city. Her phone in her pocket had been vibrating for 45 minutes. Her executive assistant, her head of security, her board members. They were tracking the car's GPS. They were losing their minds. Emma leaned her head against the cold glass of the window. A strange, unfamiliar sensation was spreading through her chest. It wasn't happiness. She was too pragmatic, too damaged for anything that simple. It was relief, a terrifying, dizzying lack of gravity. She had severed a thread. It was small, just a car, but it was a start. She closed her eyes, listening to the rattle of the taxi's loose muffler, and for the first time in 10 years, she fell asleep in a moving vehicle. Kevin didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars drag shadows across his ceiling. Every time he heard a car door slam down in the lot, his heart hammered against his ribs. Somebody's keying it. Somebody's stealing the wheels. By 6 a.m., the grey, bruised light of dawn crept through the cheap plastic blinds. Kevin got up, his body aching, the familiar stiffness in his lower back flaring up. He walked into the cramped kitchen, filled the kettle, and spooned instant coffee into a chipped mug. "Dad?" Kevin turned. Leo was standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, wearing oversized pajama bottoms that dragged on the linoleum floor. "Hey, buddy, you're up early." "I heard a noise outside," Leo mumbled, shuffling to the window overlooking the parking lot. He peered through the blinds, standing on his tiptoes. Kevin froze, the kettle hovering over his mug. Leo's breath fogged the cold glass. "Dad, look." Kevin walked over and looked down. In the pale morning light, the Ferrari was impossible to ignore. It looked alien. A bright, aggressive slash of crimson against the grey, crumbling concrete of the complex. 2 of Kevin's neighbors, a guy who worked night shifts at the bottling plant and a teenager smoking a cigarette, were standing 10 feet away from it, just staring, keeping a respectful distance as if they expected it to explode. "Is that a spaceship?" Leo asked, his voice hushed with genuine awe. "No, Leo, it's a mistake," Kevin said, the bitterness leaking into his voice before he could stop it. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "Go get dressed. We have to make a stop before school." An hour later, Kevin was back in the driver's seat. Leo was strapped into the passenger seat, his eyes wide, his small hands clutching the edges of the thick leather bolsters. The V12 engine rumbled beneath them, shaking the empty plastic booster seat Kevin had jammed behind them, which obviously didn't fit. "Don't touch any buttons, Leo. I mean it. Keep your hands on your knees." "It smells funny," Leo said, scrunching his nose. "Like a new shoe." "Yeah, like a very, very expensive shoe." Kevin navigated the morning rush hour with white-knuckled terror. The car drank gas. He watched the digital fuel gauge tick down in real time as he idled in traffic. The anxiety was a physical weight pressing on his sternum. If someone rear-ended him, he was bankrupt. If he got pulled over for driving an unregistered, uninsured supercar, he was going to jail. He didn't drive to the Vanguard Hotel. He drove to the corporate address printed on the back of the title envelope, Croft Holdings, a monolithic skyscraper in the financial district. He pulled up to the security barricade at the underground parking entrance. A guard in a tactical vest stepped out of the booth, his hand resting casually near his radio. The guard took one look at the Ferrari, then leaned down to look at Kevin. Kevin looked entirely out of place. He was wearing his faded hoodie, and a 6-year-old was sitting in the passenger seat eating dry Cheerios out of a Ziploc bag. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his tone flat, suspicious. "I need to see Emma Croft," Kevin said. It sounded ridiculous out loud. He felt a flush of humiliation. "I have her car. She left it with me last night." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to deep, bureaucratic confusion. He looked at the license plate, keyed something into his radio earpiece, and frowned. "Pull over there. Cut the engine." 10 minutes later, a man in a sharp navy suit hurried out of the elevators and approached the car. He looked furious, a vein throbbing faintly at his temple. "Mr. Pendelton?" the suit asked through the rolled-down window, glancing at a tablet in his hand. "I'm Elias, Chief of Security for Ms. Croft. Step out of the vehicle, please." Kevin turned off the engine, told Leo to stay put, and stepped out. The underground garage was cold, smelling of floor wax and exhaust. "I'm giving it back," Kevin said immediately, holding out the key and the manila envelope. "I didn't steal it. She gave it to me, but I can't take it. It's insane. The insurance, the gas. It's a curse, not a gift. Take it." Elias didn't reach for the keys. He stared at Kevin, his jaw tight. "Ms. Croft informed us of the transaction against the advice of her legal counsel, her wealth manager, and myself. She refuses to report the vehicle stolen. She insists it is your property." "I don't want it," Kevin said, his voice rising, echoing slightly off the concrete walls. "Look at me, man. Do I look like a guy who can afford the oil change on this thing? I make $14 an hour. This car is a liability. It'll ruin me." Elias hesitated. For a brief second, the corporate mask slipped, and Kevin saw genuine exhaustion in the security chief's eyes. "I understand, but she won't take it back. She's not in a rational state of mind regarding her assets today." "Then I'm leaving it here," Kevin said stubbornly, dropping the keys onto the hood of the car. They hit the immaculate red paint with a heavy metallic clatter. Kevin winced slightly at the sound. "I wouldn't do that," a voice echoed from the bank of elevators. Kevin turned. Emma was walking toward them. She looked worse than the night before. She was wearing a different suit, sharp and grey, but her hair was pulled back tightly, emphasizing the sharp angles of her pale face. She held a cup of black coffee. "If you leave it here," Emma said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I'll just have it towed to a scrapyard and crushed." Elias groaned quietly. "Emma, please. Be reasonable." "I am perfectly reasonable," she snapped, though her voice wavered on the edge of something brittle. She stopped a few feet from Kevin. She didn't look at Elias. She only looked at the valet. "I gave it to you. A deal is a deal." "It wasn't a deal, lady. It was a breakdown," Kevin said. He was tired, his feet hurt, and he didn't care that she was a billionaire. He pointed a finger at her. "You had a bad night. I get it. But you don't get to dump your midlife crisis onto my lap. I have a kid in that car. I have to get him to first grade. I don't have time to play games with $500,000. Emma flinched. The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked past Kevin through the tinted glass of the passenger window. She could just make out the silhouette of the small boy, happily chewing on cereal, entirely oblivious to the tension radiating outside. She looked back at Kevin. She noticed the deep lines around his mouth, the defensive, protective way he stood between her and the passenger door. "I didn't give it to you to hurt you," Emma said, her voice dropping, losing its commanding edge. "I gave it to you because you looked like someone who actually understands the value of things. I don't." Kevin let out a harsh, cynical laugh. "The value? The value of this car is that it eats my rent money in premium gas in a week. That's its value to me." Emma stared at the keys resting on the red hood. The internal contradiction was tearing at her. She wanted to be rid of the car, rid of the anchor, but Kevin was right. She had just handed a drowning man an anvil made of gold. "Fine," Emma said softly, the fight draining out of her. She took a sip of her cold coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "You can't afford it. I was selfish." She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and clicked a heavy silver pen. She leaned against the concrete pillar, scribbled a number, signed it, and ripped it out. She walked over and shoved it against Kevin's chest. Kevin looked down. It was a check for $50,000. "What is this?" Kevin asked, his voice tight. "A buyback," Emma said, looking him dead in the eyes, her tone returning to the sharp, deadpan cadence of a CEO. "You own the car. I'm buying it back from you. 50 grand. Now take your son to school." Kevin stared at the slip of paper. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored stock, the kind of paper that felt closer to fabric than wood pulp. The ink from her pen was a dark, wet, navy blue. A 5. 4 zeros. The underground garage was dead silent, save for the hum of the ventilation fans and the distant, rhythmic dripping of a leaking pipe somewhere in the dark. Kevin's thumb brushed the edge of the check. His chest felt tight, a sharp, suffocating pressure expanding behind his ribs. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, and he hated it. He wanted to tear the check in half. He wanted to throw it at her feet, get back into his broken-down Civic, and pretend the last 12 hours had never happened. He wanted to be a man who couldn't be bought. But he thought about the cracked linoleum in his kitchen. He thought about the final notice from the electric company. He thought about Leo's winter coat, the one that was 2 sizes too small, leaving the boy's wrists exposed to the biting October wind. Poverty didn't just drain your bank account, it eroded your dignity, choice by agonizing choice. Kevin slowly folded the check in half. The crease was sharp. He slid it into the front pocket of his faded hoodie, keeping his hand over it as if the wind might tear it away. "You think this fixes it?" Kevin asked, his voice rough, scraping against the silence of the concrete cavern. Emma didn't flinch. "Fixes what? Whatever made you hand a $500,000 machine to a stranger at 11 o'clock at night," Kevin said. He stepped away from the car, putting distance between himself and the glaring red paint. "You think writing a number on a piece of paper fills the hole? Because it doesn't. It just transfers the weight." Elias, the security chief, took a step forward, his hand raising slightly. "Mr. Pendelton, I think it's time you—" "No, Elias, stop," Emma said sharply. She didn't look away from Kevin. No one spoke to her like this. For a decade, she had existed in an echo chamber of wealth. Board members, sycophants, wealth managers, they all smoothed their words, sanding down the edges of reality so they wouldn't scratch her. Kevin wasn't sanding anything down. He was looking at her with a mixture of pity and resentment, and for the first time in months, Emma felt grounded. The dizzying, nauseating float of her existence stopped. She looked at the elevator banks. The brass doors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. Upstairs, a merger meeting was waiting. Spreadsheets, lawyers, the systemic dismantling of a Midwest shipping company. She felt a cold sweat break across the back of her neck. She couldn't go back up there. Not yet. Emma walked past Kevin. She bypassed Elias. She walked straight to the passenger side of the Ferrari and pulled the handle. The door swung open. "What are you doing?" Elias demanded, panic bleeding into his professional tone. "Emma, you have the board in 20 minutes. Cancel it," she said, sliding into the low, rigid bucket seat. The leather groaned softly under her weight. "I can't just cancel a quarterly." "I said cancel it, Elias. Tell them I have food poisoning. Tell them I died. I don't care." She pulled the heavy door shut with a solid, echoing thud. She lowered the passenger window halfway and looked out at Kevin, who was still standing by the concrete pillar, completely bewildered. "You have to take your son to school, right?" Emma asked. Kevin blinked. "Yeah, it's across the river." "Then drive," she said. "The buyout includes a ride." Kevin looked at Elias. The security chief looked like he was chewing on glass, but he gave a curt, defeated nod, stepping back toward the security booth. Kevin rubbed his jaw, feeling the heavy scratch of his day-old beard. This was insane. But he had a check for $50,000 burning a hole against his thigh, and he wasn't about to test the volatility of a billionaire on the edge of a breakdown. He walked around the hood and slid into the driver's seat. In the back, wedged awkwardly between the seats in the narrow cargo shelf, Leo was still chewing on Cheerios. He stared at Emma with the wide, unblinking intensity of a 6-year-old. Emma turned her head slightly, stiff and uncomfortable. She didn't know how to interact with children. They were chaotic, unpredictable variables. "Are you the car lady?" Leo asked, his voice slightly muffled by dry cereal. "I suppose I am," Emma said, her tone rigid. Leo pointed a sticky finger at the dashboard. "Dad says this car is a mistake, like when I spilled juice on the rug." Emma let out a sudden, sharp breath. It wasn't a laugh exactly, but it was close. A dry, jagged sound that caught in her throat. She looked at Kevin, who was furiously pressing the ignition button, his ears burning red. "Your dad is a very perceptive man," Emma said softly. The V12 roared to life, shaking the concrete dust from the rafters. Kevin shifted into gear, the heavy transmission clunking into place. He pulled out of the corporate garage, the aggressive exhaust note echoing off the walls, and merged into the grey, rain-slicked morning traffic. The elementary school drop-off line was a chaotic parade of dented minivans and aging sedans. When the red Ferrari 812 Superfast rolled up to the curb, the entire block seemed to freeze. Crossing guards stopped blowing their whistles. Parents paused mid-sentence. Kevin threw the car into park. His face was a mask of sheer humiliation. He hated drawing attention. He existed by being invisible, by blending into the background of a city that didn't care about him. Now he was sitting in a beacon of absurd wealth. He unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed out, the cold air hitting his face. He walked around, opened the passenger door, and leaned the seat forward so Leo could scramble out of the back. "Okay, buddy. Have a good day. Don't forget your lunchbox," Kevin said, his voice low, trying to ignore the stares burning into his back. Leo hoisted his faded, frayed backpack onto his small shoulders. He looked up at his dad, then peeked into the car at Emma. "Bye, car lady." "Goodbye, Leo," Emma said. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Kevin knelt down on the wet asphalt. He didn't care about the knees of his jeans. He pulled Leo's jacket collar up, zipping it to the boy's chin. He lingered for a second, resting his rough, calloused hand on the side of Leo's face. It was a fiercely protective gesture, grounded in a deep, quiet terror of the world. "I'll pick you up at 3. Mrs. Gable is off today. It's just us." Emma watched them from the low vantage point of the passenger seat. She felt a strange, dull ache in the center of her chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was the realization of profound emptiness. She had $4 billion, but no one in the world would kneel on wet pavement for her. No one would look at her the way Kevin looked at his son, as if the boy were the only tether keeping him from floating off into the dark. Kevin stood up, watched Leo run through the chain-link gates, and got back into the car. He shut the door, isolating them in the heavy scent of leather and expensive conditioning oil. "Where to?" Kevin asked, gripping the steering wheel. "Back to the ivory tower?" "No," Emma said. She looked out the windshield at the grey, overcast sky. "Keep driving. Get on the interstate. Go north." "I don't work for you," Kevin said defensively. "I know," she replied. "But I'm asking." Kevin looked at her. The harsh daylight was unforgiving. Without the shadows of the underground garage, he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the brittle tension in her jaw. She looked like a woman who had been holding her breath for years. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence for 40 minutes. Kevin kept the Ferrari strictly at the speed limit, merging onto Interstate 95. The city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by the sprawling, industrial decay of the outskirts, rusting water towers, endless lines of power grids, and dormant factories. The heavy, rattling hum of the V12 became a drone. The tension in the small cabin began to bleed out, replaced by a strange, mutual exhaustion. They were two people entirely burned out by opposite ends of the economic spectrum. "Take the next exit," Emma said suddenly. Kevin flicked the blinker. He navigated down a cracked off-ramp that ended at a desolate stretch of two-lane highway. Sitting alone on the corner was a diner, The neon sign in the window was half burned out, buzzing with a faint, angry electrical sound. Kevin parked the Ferrari near a rusted dumpster in the back, far away from the front windows. He cut the engine. The silence rang in his ears. They walked into the diner. It smelled of old grease, burnt coffee, and pine sol. The booths were upholstered in faded red vinyl, patched with strips of duct tape. An older waitress behind the counter didn't even look up from her crossword puzzle as they sat down in a back booth. Kevin ordered black coffee. Emma did the same. When the mugs arrived, they were thick ceramic, stained brown around the rims. Emma wrapped her hands around the hot porcelain. Her bespoke wool suit looked violently out of place against the greasy Formica table. "Why did you do it?" Kevin finally asked. He rested his elbows on the table, picking at a tear in a sugar packet. "Really? Don't give me a corporate answer. Why hand the keys to a valet?" Emma stared into the dark liquid in her mug. "Because I was drowning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the car was heavy. It was just another thing I bought to convince myself I was alive. But it didn't work. When you joked about it being yours, you were so flippant. You looked at this thing that terrified me, and you made it a joke. I just wanted it gone." "So you made it my problem," Kevin said, though the anger was gone from his voice. "I made a mistake," Emma corrected, looking up at him. "I thought getting rid of the anchor would fix me. I didn't realize I was throwing it onto your neck. That's why I bought it back." Kevin reached into his pocket. He pulled out the folded check. He laid it flat on the table, pressing his thick, grease-stained thumb over the crease to smooth it out. 50 grand, Kevin murmured. "You know what this is to me? This is 5 years of breathing. This is a new transmission for my car. This is Leo going to a dentist who doesn't work out of a strip mall." He looked up at her, his eyes hard, bright with an emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. "I hate that I need it. I hate that you can just scribble on a piece of paper and change my entire life. While to you, it's a rounding error." "It's not a rounding error," Emma said quietly. "It's the first time in 10 years my money actually did something real." They sat in silence. The buzzing neon sign flickered, casting a red hue across the table. Kevin took a sip of the terrible coffee. He folded the check again and put it back in his pocket. It felt like armor. It felt like safety. "So, what happens now?" Kevin asked. "I take you back to the city?" Emma pulled a sleek silver smartphone from her pocket. She tapped the screen a few times, holding it up. "I just pinned our location for Elias. He's sending a flatbed truck to pick up the car. I'm not getting back in it." "How are we getting back?" "I ordered a black car. It'll be here in 20 minutes. She took a sip of her coffee and grimaced at the bitter taste, but she didn't put the mug down. She looked at Kevin. "You can ride back with me, or I can call you a cab." "There's a bus stop about a mile down this road," Kevin said, pointing toward the window. "Route 42. Takes me right into my neighborhood. I think I'd rather take the bus." Emma nodded slowly. She understood. The collision of their worlds was over. They had served their purpose to one another. He had given her a moment of brutal honesty. She had given him a lifeline. Continuing to exist in the same space would only ruin the fragile balance they had struck. Kevin slid out of the booth. He stood up, dropping 2 crumpled dollar bills on the table for the coffee. He looked down at the billionaire sitting in the cheap vinyl booth. She looked small. She looked tired, but she didn't look as hollow as she had the night before. "Hey," Kevin said. Emma looked up. "Don't buy another Ferrari," he said deadpan. "They're a massive pain in the ass to park." A genuine, quiet smile broke across Emma's face. It didn't reach her eyes, not fully, but it was a start. "I'll keep that in mind, Kevin." Kevin turned and walked out of the diner. The cold wind hit him instantly, but as he zipped up his hoodie and began the mile walk down the cracked shoulder of the highway, he didn't feel the chill. He reached into his pocket, his rough thumb tracing the sharp, folded edge of the paper. For the first time in 3 years, his chest didn't ache when he breathed. Did Kevin do the right thing by taking the money, or did he let his pride be bought by a billionaire trying to clear her conscience? Sometimes survival is messy, and doing the right thing for your family means swallowing your pride. If this raw, grounded story resonated with you, hit the like button, share it with someone who appreciates real human drama, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that don't pull their punches. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.